Today I'm celebrating Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst. I think he originally trained as a psychiatrist, but a mystic and a visionary who has contributed so much to the understanding of human culture and the human mind. He really caught my interest, I suppose, probably about 20 or 30 years ago when first really exploring psychology, and although it took me some time to really understand his significance and what made him so different to other people in the field. And I'm probably not the least qualified, but I'm not exactly someone who's read his entire works because they are voluminous, and as I understand it, there are many Jungian psychologists that have still barely scraped the surface of all that he contributed. So I'm not an authority in that kind of way, but I still can celebrate this guy's particular genius, his unique style and talent, and what it is that I've taken from his life. So let me share. My first encounters with him was drawing the comparison between Freud and Jung, because Freud, although he's sometimes dismissed by moderns because some of the stuff that he did was very reductionist, he was basically a cocaine addict that thought that everything came down to sex. And one only has to look at what happened to his daughter, who I believe died a virgin and was extremely repressed. It suggests that there wasn't something quite right in the family line there. But he did, however, frame the idea of psychoanalysis and dream interpretation and kind of the idea that one could talk oneself better, which was already a massive thing, especially as people were developing more and more neuroses, probably as a result of industrialization and people moving to cities and living in such close proximity in a very alienated world. So Freud made a big contribution, and Jung became his student, although I sense that it was the student that rapidly became the master. Now, Jung is a fascinating guy, and his autobiography is a brilliant read, and it's incredible to think of how much that guy learnt in the course of a lifetime. He mastered English, French, Spanish, Latin, Greek, but also numerous other languages, I think including Sanskrit and whatever, because he was one of the most avid researchers about the world that one can imagine. He explored the magical rites, the tribal traditions, the linguistic origins, the patterns of culture that have been identified and noticed all around the world, and he did this unbelievable job of collating all of this information from anthropologists. And I mean, his library must have been vast. And I've heard Terence McKenna, who is one of the best read people that I've ever encountered, talking about the footnotes to Carl Jung's material and how that was just utterly mind-blowing for him, because there was so much detail in the research that he carried out. But not only was he a scientist and approached the science of the mind, with the scientific method, with taking copious notes and really treating his analysis of human beings as the very serious subject that it is. And not only did he support and radically change the lives for the better of hundreds of patients, I'm sure it must be thousands, often working with them over extensive periods of time, he also was his very own subject of an experiment, and he did that in such a careful way, because how can you analyze oneself? How can, in the scientific method, there's such a distinction between subject and object. How can one be the subject observing object in an experiment and yet be the object of that experiment. You know, it's a crazy thing, and yet he kept journals in such a disciplined way and underwent experiments and relayed his experiences in such clear ways that it's remarkable. So not only did he have this understanding of the world that I'm pretty confident is incomparable. Like, there are polymaths in this world. There are inventors and geniuses, people that understand maths and physics and art and all sorts of different subjects. But like, he was an incredible illustrator, an incredible painter, but had so much more besides. One of the things that I really found incredible about Carl Jung, I only discovered in the last few weeks. It's a letter that he wrote to someone following a near-death experience, because he had died for a while on the operating table, or if it wasn't on the operating table, it was at least at the result of heart failure. And he was clinically dead for some time, and during that time had an epiphany. Now, the guy had always been a mystic. At one point in his life, it seemed, or he questioned or wondered if he wasn't actually going insane himself. But it was a period of deep mysticism, and it's crazy to think that he was working with clients and still providing this incredible anchor to their lives, whilst somehow managing to compartmentalize a part of himself that was having all of these mystic revelations and drawing these incredible mandala and having these visions. That's documented in the Red Book, I believe. So he's this incredible writer, he's this psychologist, he's this researcher, he's this compiler of information that knew things about aspects of the world, that, you know, has an understanding of them so profoundly that we, you know, it's just such a rare thing to find someone like that. He studied alchemy, and through that had this incredible understanding of astrology and geomancy and sacred geometry, and the list goes on and on and on. So he has this mystic revelation, or he has many during the course of his life, but then there's this one following his near-death experience, which appears or is mentioned once in a letter that is never published, and I believe he even forbids it to ever be published, or I can't remember the detail about that. But it is fascinating, and I can see why he didn't want to have it published, because he was so dedicated to the science of the mind that he didn't want to give anybody the opportunity to disregard the work that he was doing because they saw him as being woo, that he had suddenly taken a flight of fancy and left his senses behind. But in my opinion, it was far from that. I've absolutely loved hearing about the encounter of one of my favourite philosophers, Alan Watts, with Carl Jung. They met after, I believe Alan Watts was one of those few people that did read the entire works of Carl Jung and loved his work. It clearly informed a lot of what he said. And there's a beautiful account of when they met. And if I remember correctly, well, the picture I got of it is these two sages sitting opposite each other, smiling. And Alan Watts had considered going into psychoanalysis. He'd been surrounded by psychoanalysts through much of his life during the 60s and the 70s and had so many opportunities, but he never felt like he wanted to surrender to analysis. And he sat opposite Carl Jung, and they smiled at each other. And this could have been the moment where he said, maybe I'll take some sessions with you. But they smiled at each other and met and parted and went their separate ways. And for me, that kind of also helped me, I think, to put to bed the desire to go through psychoanalysis, that I feel like I'm my own teacher in this life, and that if I listen carefully to myself, the answers will be revealed. I mean, it's not just this navel-gazing, I've got all the answers type thing, but because the answers are so often in the world and there's so many people to learn from, like Alan Watts, like Carl Jung. And yet, the answers can appear from within, and we don't need to have another human mirror. A human mirror, I mean, to be a human mirror, it's a tricky thing, because if you think of a mirror, it provides a flawless reflection. How well do we have to know and love ourselves to be able to afford a meaningful reflection to another person? You know, I have big concerns about the world of therapy and the sort of therapy people receive, because the desire to be a therapist is maybe revealed in the words "the rapist." And I think it's an undertaking that requires immense integrity and love. And Carl Jung talked a great deal about love and the positive motivation, the positive regard that people need to have their clients in order to be able to help them. And how ultimately people need to have a positive regard for life to get anything from it. So Carl Jung is this phenomenon of the 20th century who not only did so much to understand the past of human culture, to kind of be able to put us on a map in time, to be able to explain where it is that we've come from, but also to observe what was going on. His understanding of the religious scriptures from around the world, his awareness of comparative religion is just unparalleled. And he then was able to take all of that understanding of what has happened, the cultures out of which we've been born, the experimental evidence of all the people that he was able to analyse during the course of a lifetime, married with his own self-analysis, married with his mystical experiences and his dedication to the scientific method, makes him singularly probably one of the most important people ever to have lived, in the terms of how much impact his work has the potential to unleash, and has already unleashed. So today I'm celebrating Carl Jung.